They found the pyramids by accident. Not the famous ones, not the ones tourists pose in front of. These pyramids were silent, hid, smaller but sharper. Dozens of them, standing in the middle of a desert no one talks about. And the archaeologists who saw them realized something terrifying. Egypt was not the only land of pharaohs, not the first, not even the most mysterious. Another empire had been here, older, darker, fiercer, and almost completely erased from history. This is the story of that empire, the kingdom of Kush. For centuries, the world has been told a simple narrative. Egypt was the shining jewel of the ancient world, and everything south of it was primitive. But dig beneath the sand, and the myth collapses, because the truth is shocking. While Egyptian civilization was rising in the north, another power was forming below it, a kingdom wealthy enough to rival the Pharaohs, a kingdom that controlled gold mines so rich they fueled the wealth of continents, a kingdom that mastered warfare, crafts, architecture, diplomacy and kingship in ways that shook Egypt to its core. The only reason you don't hear this story everywhere is because history chose sides, and Kush was not the side that got to write the books. Imagine the Nile cutting through scorching deserts, not the calm river of Egypt, but a violent, unpredictable force. Rapids, canyons, sharp rocks. A river that demanded strength to survive. The people of Kush grew up along this river. They fought its currents. They shaped its banks. They learned to work with land that refused to cooperate. And they became hard, skilled, unbreakable. A civilization forged by the harshest conditions Africa could offer. They built cities out of stone, while others were still building huts. They designed pottery so advanced modern creators still study it. They wore gold, not as decoration, but as identity. They organized armies of archers so deadly Egyptian soldiers would whisper their name with fear. They created temples aligned with sacred mountains. They crowned kings who ruled not just by blood, but by divine power tied to the land and its spirits. This was no small kingdom, no forgotten tribe. Kush was an empire, and it grew while the world wasn't watching. The question is simple. If Kush was so great, why is it missing from most history lessons? The answer is uncomfortable. Egypt survived through its stones. Kush survived through its people. Monuments in Egypt were built on open plains where they stood untouched for millennia. But in Kush, the desert winds swallowed everything. Sandstorms buried temples. Time erased inscriptions. Wars shattered tombs. Looters emptied pyramids. Colonial scholars ignored or downplayed African achievements. And slowly an empire that once rivaled the greatest on earth slipped into silence. But the silence is finally cracking, because every year archaeologists uncover pieces of Kush that rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient Africa. Deep tombs filled with gold, statues with unmistakable Nubian features, weapons forged with advanced techniques, royal pyramids lined up like guardians of lost kings, and the most shocking discovery of all, evidence that Kush didn't just survive Egypt. They conquered Egypt. But before we reach that part, we must understand their rise, their purpose, their identity. Kush was built on contradictions, a land that looked barren but produced wealth beyond imagination. A people who lived in isolation but influenced empires across continents. A kingdom that loved peace but mastered war. They were traders and conquerors, priests and soldiers, diplomats and rebels. Somehow the harsh environment didn't limit them, it elevated them. The earliest Kushites didn't imitate anyone. Their art was uniquely African. Their spiritual beliefs were tied to the sun. The river, the mountains, and the ancestors. Their politics were sophisticated, their royal families interwove bloodlines, rituals, and power structures that lasted for centuries, and their society respected women in ways rare in the ancient world. It wasn't unusual for a Kushite queen to command armies, rule territories, negotiate alliances, and decide the fate of nations. Everything about Kush challenges expectations. This is why it was forgotten. It didn't fit the narrative the world was comfortable with. But the truth doesn't disappear just because people ignore it. It waits. Beneath sand. Beneath time. Beneath the stories of conquerors who tried to erase anyone who dared to rival them. Walk through the ruins of ancient Kush today, and you can almost feel them. The echoes of festivals celebrating the Nile flood. The chants of priests calling on the god Amun. The pounding of drums during royal coronations near sacred peaks. The crack of archers practicing before battle. The heavy silence of pyramids where kings slept wrapped in gold. Everything whispers the same message. We were here, we mattered, and we shaped history. But the world moved on, and Kush vanished from memory. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded so well that other empires felt threatened. Egypt copied Kushite clothing, rituals, even crowns. Rome feared the armies of Kushite queens. Assyria wrote about Nubian warriors with uneasy respect. Ethiopia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean all took pieces of Kushite culture into their own. Kush didn't die, it transformed, it spread, it blended, and its legacy hides inside nations and cultures that still flourish today. When you see African pyramids, you're looking at Kush. When you hear stories of warrior queens, you're hearing Kush. When you study the trade networks of the ancient world, you're following Kushite roots. When you learn about the deep South Nile civilizations, you're stepping into Kushite territory. This empire was not forgotten because it was small. It was forgotten because it was powerful, and powerful nations often fear the rise of others. Now the story is coming back. The Sans are giving up their secrets, and the forgotten pharaohs of Africa are finally rising again. Listen closely. Before Egypt carved its first pyramid, before its pharaohs wore crowns of gold, before hieroglyphs danced across stone walls, a different kingdom was rising in the deep south. A kingdom older than recorded memory, a kingdom so wealthy it glittered beneath the desert sun, a kingdom so powerful its name once made Egypt tremble. This was Kush. You are about to step into a world that history tried to bury, a world built on gold, iron, kings, queens, and a river that shaped destiny itself. This is not background, this is not a side chapter. This is the foundation of one of Africa's greatest civilizations. This is where the story truly begins. Picture the ancient Nile. Not the peaceful waters seen in modern pictures. No, this Nile is wild, untamed, explosive, rushing through stone canyons, slamming into rapids, drowning everything in its path during the flood season. This river demanded courage, it demanded strength, it demanded innovation. And the people who settled here, the ancestors of Kush, rose to meet every challenge. They farmed land that cracked beneath the sun. They hunted across plains, scorched dry. They carved homes from stone where others used clay. They learned to read the rhythms of a river that could destroy them at any moment. Every year was a test. Every generation was a lesson. Kush was not shaped by comfort. It was shaped by survival, and survival made them extraordinary. When you walk across ancient Nubia today, you find clues everywhere. Pottery smoother than anything produced in Egypt at the same time. stone foundations of buildings older than many Egyptian towns, cemeteries full of elaborate burials, some containing hundreds of cattle sacrificed to honor a single noble. These were not primitive people. These were people who understood wealth, status, leadership, spirituality. The land itself defined them. Nubia is fierce. Mountains rise abruptly, blocking the wind. The desert burns hotter than Egypt's. The river carves deep scars into the earth, and beneath this harsh landscape lies gold, pure gold, thick veins of it, enough to make ancient kings salivate, enough to fuel entire economies, enough to turn Nubia into a magnet for trade, ambition and conflict. This is why Egypt kept its eyes locked on the south. This is why Egyptian scribes wrote about Nubia in voices dripping with both admiration and fear. Nubia had what Egypt desperately needed: gold for its temples, gold for its queens, gold for its eternity-obsessed culture. But Kush wasn't just sitting on wealth. They were building an empire with it. Long before Egypt conquered Nubia, the Kushites built their first great city, Kerma. Kerma rose from the desert like something impossible. Massive mud brick structures unlike anything in the region. A central temple complex, the Defofa towering above the city like a fortress of faith. Tombs large enough to hold hundreds of sacrificed cattle, their horns still found in the sands today. Palaces, workshops, pottery studios, blacksmith forges, and evidence of trade stretching not just to Egypt, but deep into Africa, across the Red Sea, and even into the Near East. This was a kingdom of wealth, a kingdom of builders, a kingdom of warriors, but above all, a kingdom of identity. The people of Kush were not Egyptians. They wore their hair differently, their clothes differently, their jewelry differently. Their kings were crowned differently. Their gods were different. Their architecture was different. They had their own languages, their own scripts, their own vision of what it meant to rule. Egypt noticed, and Egypt felt threatened. The two powers clashed again and again. Egypt wanted Nubia's gold, ivory, cattle, and manpower. Kush wanted independence. They fought across deserts, across riverbanks, across trade routes. Sometimes Egypt won, sometimes Kush won. But neither side broke completely. And here is the twist many people don't know. Egypt's victories over Nubia didn't destroy Kush. They strengthened it. Egypt built temples in Nubia, roads, administrative centers, storage systems, mines. When Egypt eventually weakened, Kush absorbed all of it. They took what the Egyptians left behind and used it to build the next stage of their empire. Kush was learning, watching, transforming. When Egypt fell into chaos, weak kings, foreign invasions, internal corruption, Kush rose again, this time more powerful than ever. They moved their capital north to Napata, beneath the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal, a place the Egyptians claimed was the birthplace of the god Amun, a place filled with myth and spiritual energy, a place the Kushites claimed as their own. Here they created something new, a kingdom with African roots and Egyptian influence, but tied together with unique Nubian pride. They built temples that rivaled Egypt's. They resurrected forgotten rituals. They trained warriors with precision and discipline. They crowned kings who saw themselves not as Egypt's descendants, but as its rightful successors. This second rise of Kush laid the foundation for the most shocking chapter in the kingdom's history, the conquest of Egypt. But we are not there yet. Before we reach that era, we must understand the spiritual and cultural transformation happening in Napata. Kushite kings weren't just political leaders, they were spiritual symbols. chosen by gods, anchored to the land, tested through rituals that demanded courage and purity. This mindset gave Kush a strength Egypt underestimated, because while Egyptian pharaohs argued among themselves, Kushite kings ruled with unity. While Egypt struggled with droughts and instability, Kush thrived. While Egypt looked north for alliances, Kush looked inward, growing stronger from its own soil. Their art became richer, their temples became grander, their queens gained more influence, their military became sharper, and their identity became undeniable. This wasn't a kingdom pretending to be Egypt. This wasn't a culture copying its neighbor. This was an African empire asserting dominance on its own terms. The origins of Kush are not simple beginnings. They are foundations carved in strength and ambition. They tell a story of people who refused to disappear, who adapted, who fought, who rose from the desert again and again, no matter who tried to push them back down. And as centuries passed, a realization spread across the Nile. Egypt was not the only power. Egypt was not the only kingdom with divine rulers. Egypt was not the only empire destined for greatness. A new force was rising in the south, a force Egypt could no longer ignore, because soon the black pharaohs of Kush would march north, and Egypt would kneel. It began with smoke rising in the desert, not from war, not from destruction, from industry, from life, from a city growing so large, so wealthy, so unexpected that Egypt could no longer pretend it didn't exist. That city was Kerma, and for centuries it stood as the heart of a kingdom powerful enough to challenge the greatest empire on the Nile. Kerma wasn't an accident. It wasn't a temporary settlement. It was the result of generations of survival, ambition, and mastery of a land that tried every day to break the people who lived on it. The early Nubians learned to control the river's unpredictable floods. They learned to build cities from mud brick that could withstand brutal heat. They learned to trade with cultures most Egyptians had never heard of. Slowly, quietly, they shaped a kingdom. But Kerma wasn't just another ancient town. It was a declaration, a roar, a symbol that said, "We are here, and we are strong." Walk through its ruins today, and you can still feel the intensity of the lives lived there. The central structure, the Western Pharaohs, rises like a broken giant from the sand. Its walls once stood 4 stories tall, thick, imposing, built with precision. This fortress-like temple wasn't simply for worship. It was a center of power, a hub where priests, elites, kings and traders moved in and out, shaping decisions that affected the entire kingdom. Kerma wasn't built around fear. It was built around confidence. Its leaders didn't try to imitate Egypt. They weren't interested in becoming Egyptian. Their sculptures, their pottery, their clothing, their burial customs, everything screamed identity. Everything declared independence. This confidence came from wealth, real wealth. Wealth that couldn't be ignored. Kushite gold moved through Kerma like lifeblood. Excavations have revealed workshops where gold was melted, shaped, hammered, and polished. Craftsmen turned raw gold into bracelets, crowns, rings, and ornaments. Traders came from as far as Central Africa, from the Red Sea coast, from the savanna kingdoms, from the mountains. They brought incense, ivory, ebony, exotic feathers, cattle, precious stones. Kerma became a marketplace of the ancient world. A crossroads where goods and cultures mixed, and with wealth came power. Kerma developed one of the most feared armies in the region, not because of sheer size, but because of skill. The archers of Kush were legendary. Egyptian texts describe them with a combination of respect and fear. Tall, disciplined fighters with bows as tall as themselves. Warriors who could shoot with deadly precision while running. Men who moved through the desert faster than Egyptian armies could follow. Their arrows, sleek and long, could pierce armor Egyptian soldiers trusted too much. Egypt understood what Kerma was becoming. A rising threat. A rival. A mirror image in the south. And Egypt did what powerful empires always do when they see a competitor gaining strength. They tried to control it. Egypt launched campaigns into Nubia. They seized gold mines. They built fortresses along the Nile to limit Kushite trade. They stationed troops to monitor movement. They tried to choke Kerma, cut off its wealth, break its backbone. Egypt believed it could suffocate the kingdom into submission. But Kerma did not bend. Instead, it grew stronger, bolder, more determined. During Egypt's second intermediate period, a time when Egypt was divided, unstable and weak, Kerma struck back. Hard. Kerma's kings allied with the Hyksos, Egypt's northern enemies. They pushed northward, burned Egyptian towns, took prisoners, raided temples. For the first time in history, Egypt wasn't the conqueror. Egypt was the one being tested. Imagine the shock. Imagine the fear. Egypt had always seen itself as the center of civilization. Yet here was a southern kingdom proving that the Nile didn't belong to Egypt alone. Kerma became, for a moment in time, Egypt's worst nightmare. But power is rarely permanent. After centuries of back-and-forth conflict, Egypt unified under powerful pharaohs once again. The new kingdom rose. With its rise came armies fueled by ambition. Egypt marched south with force, determined to end the Kushite threat once and for all. They stormed Kerma, burned buildings, raided tombs, captured elite, took children as hostages, smashed monuments. It was meant to be a final blow, a complete erasure. Yet even in destruction, Kerma revealed something extraordinary. Archaeologists found massive royal tombs filled with wealth, gold ornaments, sacred items, human sacrifices by the dozens. This wasn't a poor kingdom pretending to be strong. This was a true power, a great kingdom. Egypt didn't conquer a weak rival, they conquered an empire, but Egypt made a mistake. By absorbing Kerma, they exposed Nubians to Egyptian knowledge, writing, architecture, administration, religion. Kushite elites were brought to Egypt as hostages, educated in royal courts, trained in politics, familiarized with the pharaoh's rituals. Egypt believed they were civilizing Nubia. They believed they were turning Kushites into Egyptians, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Kush was watching, learning, memorizing, waiting. The people of Kerma didn't disappear, they adapted. Their culture blended with new ideas, but kept its African roots. Their identity survived in silence, waiting for the right moment. When Egypt began to weaken again centuries later, those descendants rose, and this time they were not interested in defense. They were coming for the throne. Kerma's legacy didn't die in the fire. It lived on in the bloodlines of future Kushite kings. It lived on in the bows of Nubian archers. It lived on in the minds of nobles who remembered Egypt's arrogance. It lived on in the minds of nobles who remembered Egypt's arrogance. It lived on in the spirit of a people who had tasted power and wanted it back. Kerma was the beginning. The first great kingdom of Kush. The first rise. The first challenge to Egypt's supremacy. Its ruins may be broken today, but the memory of its strength burns brighter than ever, because Kerma showed the world something unforgettable. Kush was not a shadow. Kush was not a copy. Kush was not an extension of Egypt. Kush was a rival, and soon it would become something far greater. A conqueror. Listen closely, because this is the moment Africa steps onto the world stage, with a roar powerful enough to shake empires. The sands of Kush were shifting, the Nile was watching, and history was about to witness something it had never seen before. A forgotten kingdom preparing to seize the throne of Egypt itself. This wasn't ambition. This was destiny sharpened over centuries of survival. The kingdom of Kush had risen from ashes before. It had endured Egyptian invasions, tribute demands, and cultural domination. But now, Kush was stronger, smarter, united, and its kings were ready to do more than survive. They were ready to rule. Everything begins with Alara, a name that rarely appears in school textbooks, but without him, the entire story of the Black Pharaohs collapses like a temple with no foundation. Alara didn't conquer, he unified. He brought scattered Kushite clans under one banner, forged a shared identity, and breathed life into a kingdom that had been underestimated for centuries. He planted the idea that Kush could be more than a border state, more than Egypt's apprentice, more than history's afterthought. He taught his people to look north, not with fear, but with purpose. After him came Kashta, a man carved from ambition. Kashta didn't march into Egypt with chaos. He walked in with silence and strategy. Upper Egypt didn't fight him. It accepted him, not because of force, but because Egyptians saw something in him that their own rulers lacked: strength, stability, order. Kashta became the protector of Thebes, and when he placed his daughter on the throne as God's wife of Amun, Egypt wasn't just influenced, it was claimed. But the world didn't feel the full weight of Kushite power until the arrival of a single figure, Pianki, a king whose name should be spoken with the same reverence as Ramses, Cyrus, Alexander. But rarely is. Pianki didn't seek war, he sought correction. Egypt was collapsing under rival dynasties, local warlords, and corrupt princes fighting for scraps. The country of pyramids was becoming a mosaic of broken ambitions. Pianki saw a dying flame, and he intended to relight it. He marched north with a methodical calm that terrified his enemies. His soldiers were disciplined, his chariots precise, his presence unshakable. At every city he conquered, he didn't mock the defeated. He demanded they swear loyalty to something greater than themselves. Kush wasn't a foreign invader. It was a purifying fire. Then came the moment Egypt had not experienced in centuries. A king worthy of its legacy stepped into Thebes. Not an Egyptian, not a Libyan, not a puppet. A Kushite. Pianki stood before the sacred temples, inhaled the incense of the ancient gods, and declared Egypt whole again. Under one ruler, one kingdom, one vision. The 25th dynasty, the dynasty of the Black Pharaohs, had begun. For the first time in history, an African kingdom ruled, not just itself, but the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever known. And they deserved every bit of it. Pianki's rule was not fueled by arrogance. It was anchored in respect. He restored temples, revived rituals, strengthened priesthoods. He didn't erase Egyptian culture, he elevated it. Kushite rule wasn't a takeover, it was a renaissance. And yet, the world rarely speaks of this era. When people imagine pharaohs, they picture golden skin, European features, Hollywood fantasies. But the true rulers of Egypt at this time were unmistakably African, dark-skinned, Nubian-featured, proud descendants of Kush. History tried to bury that, but truth has a way of surviving. The Black Pharaohs were more than kings. They were symbols, reminders that Africa was not a continent waiting to be discovered. It was a continent that once ruled the world's most admired empire. Their power radiated from temples, pyramids, armies and diplomacy. They weren't shadows behind Egypt. They were Egypt, but every rise attracts an enemy. And on the horizon, an empire watched Kushite Egypt with envy and fear. The Assyrians, a machine of conquest, a force built on brutality and iron. They knew the Nile kingdom was strong, but they also knew strength attracts challengers. Conflict was inevitable, but not yet, because before the war drums thundered, the dynasty reached its golden moment. Under Taharqa, a ruler whose story is both triumphant and tragic. But that is the next chapter. The Nile had never seen anything like it. A river that had carried civilizations for millennia now reflected a new power. The black pharaohs of Kush had crossed borders, transcended deserts, and claimed thrones that Egyptians had long believed were their birthright. The 25th dynasty was not a fleeting moment. It was a statement, a declaration that the South was no longer subordinate. Africa's forgotten pharaohs were here to rule. The rise of the 25th dynasty wasn't sudden, it was calculated. Generations of Kushite kings had learned patience, diplomacy, and strategy. They had watched Egypt stumble through internal chaos, divided between local rulers, priests, and warlords. And when the time came, they moved decisively. It began with Piye, sometimes called Piye, a warrior king with a vision as vast as the Nile itself. His campaigns were swift, but meticulous. Cities surrendered, not out of fear alone, but out of recognition. Piye brought order where chaos had reigned. He brought stability where faction and greed had destroyed unity. What makes the 25th dynasty extraordinary isn't just conquest, it's transformation. Piye didn't destroy what the Egyptians had built. He elevated it. Temples were restored. Priests regained authority. Monuments that had crumbled were rebuilt with Kushite ingenuity. Art and architecture fused Kushite identity with Egyptian tradition. Statues carved with Nubian features now stood beside the old gods. Kushite kings embraced Egyptian titles, rituals and symbolism, but never abandoned their roots. They fused two civilizations into one. Taharqa, Piye's successor, would carry this vision further. His reign marked the dynasty's golden age. Under Taharqa, Egypt expanded its influence into the Levant, defending it from Assyrian threats, while maintaining Kushite control over Nubia. Monuments from this period reflect an unprecedented wealth. Temples, obelisks, and statues in Thebes and Karnak displayed both Egyptian grandeur and Nubian character. The sheer scale of these constructions shows a dynasty confident in its permanence. But the 25th dynasty wasn't only about kings. Queens held extraordinary power. The Kandake, or Queen Mother, often ruled alongside or even above kings. These women were not symbolic figures. They commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and made decisions that shaped the empire. One of the most famous queens, Shanak-Dakate, ruled independently in Kush and projected authority that rivaled any pharaoh in Egypt. Their presence challenges the stereotypes of ancient leadership and shows a society where women wielded real power. The dynasty's military strength was formidable. Kushite archers were still feared across the Nile. Chariots and infantry moved with discipline, trained not just in combat but in strategy. Taharqa himself is depicted leading armies into battle, emphasizing that leadership meant action, not just ceremony. Egypt, once the dominant power, now relied on the very warriors it had once tried to subdue. Culturally, the 25th dynasty left a legacy that resonates even today. Art, religious practices, and royal iconography during this period reflected a blending of Kushite and Egyptian traditions. Temples depicted African faces with regal dignity, emphasizing the connection between the ruler and the divine. Inscriptions praised kings for their justice, military success, and devotion to the gods. Nubian symbols appeared alongside Egyptian ones, a visible declaration that Kushite identity was inseparable from this era's power. Trade flourished. The Nile remained the artery of wealth, but Kushite control of Egypt expanded networks to the Mediterranean and the Near East. Ivory, gold, and exotic goods moved south and north, bringing economic prosperity that rivaled any empire of the time. Egypt was no longer the sole center of culture and wealth. Kushite influence ensured it shared its riches, ideas, and innovations with the African South. Yet, even in this zenith, the 25th dynasty faced immense challenges. The Assyrian Empire to the northeast was expanding aggressively. Its armies, seasoned and brutal, threatened both Kush and Egypt. Inscriptions from the period describe clashes where Kushite kings and Egyptian troops fought desperately to defend their territories. Taharqa himself campaigned against these invasions, blending diplomacy and warfare to protect his empire. Each battle was a high-stakes gamble, with the fate of the dynasty hanging in the balance. Despite the pressure, the dynasty's rulers maintained legitimacy through religion and symbolism. They embraced the Egyptian concept of divine kingship while emphasizing their own lineage. By portraying themselves as gods on earth, chosen by Amun and other deities, they commanded loyalty and obedience. This combination of political savvy, religious authority, and military skill created a dynasty respected by allies and feared by enemies. The 25th dynasty was the culmination of Kushite ambition. It represented the first time an African kingdom not only survived Egyptian dominance, but became the ruler of Egypt itself. These pharaohs were more than conquerors. They were unifiers, blending cultures and creating a period of stability and prosperity in a region long marked by fragmentation. And yet, for all its achievements, the dynasty's power was precarious. External threats and internal pressures eventually forced the Kushite rulers to retreat south, but their impact could not be erased. They left Egypt with monuments, art, religious practices, and a legacy that continues to challenge perceptions of African history. The 25th dynasty reminds us that power is not static. Empires rise, fall, and transform. The Black Pharaohs of Kush reshaped history by demonstrating that leadership, vision, and resilience can overturn centuries of hierarchy. Their story forces a reconsideration of what we think we know about ancient Egypt, about Africa, and about the origins of civilization itself. When we look at this period, we don't see a foreign invasion. We see a renaissance led by a people who had endured centuries of hardship, observation, and preparation. We see leaders who combined African strength with Egyptian sophistication. We see a dynasty that proved history is written, not by those with the loudest voices, but by those with the courage, strategy, and vision to seize destiny when it appears. The rise of the 25th dynasty was not just political. It was cultural, spiritual, and deeply human. It showed that Africa was home not only to ancient kingdoms, but to rulers capable of commanding one of the world's most renowned civilizations. And it set the stage for conflicts, alliances, and legendary stories that would echo across centuries. This is the story of power, pride, and identity. The story of kings and queens whose names should never have been forgotten. The story of Kush. The Nile trembled under his ambition. Not literally, But the way the river and its people shifted under the weight of his plans was no less powerful. Pa, or Pianki as some call him, was not like the kings before him. He was born into Kush, molded by its harsh deserts and wild rivers, raised on tales of Egypt's grandeur and vulnerability, and destined to challenge everything the ancient world thought it knew about power. Imagine the scene. Egypt long divided. Upper and lower, the pharaohs of Thebes constantly battling local rulers, corruption seeping through temples, famine in the north, chaos threatening to undo centuries of civilization. Pia watched silently from the south. His army trained in the ways of Kushite discipline, archery, and strategy. His advisors calculated every move. His priests whispered omens from Jebel Barkel, and in his mind burned a vision. A united Egypt, guided by Kushite wisdom under the authority of a single crown. This was more than conquest. This was restoration. Pa saw himself as the restorer of divine order. The Egyptians called it Ma'at, the cosmic balance. But for centuries, Ma'at had been fractured. Pa believed he could restore it. He believed Kush could not only survive, but rule the Nile itself. And he was willing to risk everything to make that dream real. The campaign began quietly. Pa moved along the Nile, city by city, offering alliances, demanding loyalty, and calculating which cities would resist and which would yield. He did not rush. He did not underestimate Egypt. Instead, he combined diplomacy with intimidation. His reputation as a disciplined and unyielding ruler spread ahead of his army. Towns surrendered not out of love, but out of fear and respect. When he finally arrived at Thebes, the city of the gods, Pa's plan reached its climax. This was the heart of Egypt. If he could control Thebes, he could control the country. And he did. With strategy, ceremony, and political acumen, he claimed the city's allegiance. Priests welcomed him. Temples were restored under his name. Pa positioned himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful ruler of Ma'at, the embodiment of divine order. The northern cities were not as compliant. Memphis, the traditional capital of Egypt, resisted Kushite authority. Pa had to march further, engaging in sieges, skirmishes, and negotiations. Each victory demonstrated the unique blend of Kushite military precision and Egyptian political symbolism. He understood that to rule Egypt, he needed more than armies. He needed legitimacy, and he obtained it by embracing Egyptian culture, religious rituals, and pharaonic imagery, while never abandoning his Nubian heritage. Pa's dream wasn't just military, it was symbolic. Every temple he restored, every god he honored, every pyramid he commissioned, was a message. Kushite kings were rightful rulers, not invaders. The inscriptions left in stone were clear. Pa saw himself as a bridge between north and south, between chaos and order, between tradition and innovation. He united a fractured land under one crown, not by erasing its identity, but by enhancing it. This unification was a turning point in African and world history. For the first time, a kingdom from the south, not Egypt itself, asserted control over the Nile, demonstrating that Africa's greatest civilizations could rise, conquer, and rule. Pa's vision was more than conquest. It was integration. It was the blending of cultures, armies, religion, and governance into a single cohesive empire. But uniting the two lands came with enormous challenges. Resistance remained in the north, and Pa had to constantly negotiate between loyalty and rebellion. He relied on skilled generals, trusted advisors, and the religious authority of Amun to legitimize his rule. His leadership was a delicate balance of power, faith, and charisma, and his success depended not only on military might, but on the ability to inspire obedience and respect. Piye's reign marked the high point of Kushite influence in Egypt. Temples, statues, and inscriptions bear witness to his achievements. The Kushite pharaohs were no longer peripheral players, they were central figures in Egyptian politics, religion, and culture. Their African identity was inseparable from the throne they occupied. They proved that Nubian kings were capable not only of survival but of sophisticated governance, monumental construction, and cultural synthesis. What makes Piye's dream extraordinary is that it was visionary. Most rulers conquer, most rulers impose. Piye integrated. He saw Egypt not as a prize, but as a partner. He saw a united Nile Valley as a reflection of Kush's strength and Africa's potential, and in doing so, he changed the narrative of history. He forced the world to acknowledge that the pharaohs of Kush were as legitimate as any Egyptian ruler, and their African identity was not a weakness, it was a source of power. Under Piye, the 25th dynasty solidified its place in history. Kushite kings ruled Upper and Lower Egypt with authority, blending traditions and reinforcing the idea that Africa's civilizations were interconnected, resilient, and capable of extraordinary achievements. Piye's dream was not ephemeral, it laid the foundation for subsequent rulers, including Taharqa, who would expand Kushite influence even further. But as with all empires, greatness attracts threats. Piye's unification of Egypt set the stage for conflict with powerful neighbors. The Assyrians, ambitious and ruthless, were watching. They saw a strong, united Nile Valley under Kushite rule, and recognized the danger it posed to their expansionist ambitions. The coming centuries would be marked by battles, sieges, and the resilience of Kushite leadership against overwhelming odds. Yet Piye's legacy is secure. He proved that Africa's kingdoms could rise, conquer, and govern civilizations thought to be beyond their reach. His vision of unification, legitimacy, and integration shaped not only Kush and Egypt, but the perception of African power in the ancient world. His reign was a reminder that history is not linear, and greatness is not confined to the familiar. It can emerge from the overlooked, the underestimated, the forgotten, and reshape the world entirely. Piye's dream of uniting the two lands under one crown was a milestone. It demonstrated courage, wisdom, and strategic genius. It reshaped Egypt, elevated Kush, and created a dynasty that would inspire fear, respect, and admiration across the ancient world. His name may be rarely mentioned in classrooms today, but the stones, temples, and pyramids of Upper and Lower Egypt whisper it across millennia. Piye, the unifier, the visionary, the Black Pharaoh who dared to claim destiny. History has a way of punishing greatness with fire. Empires rise, but others watch, and when they do, conflict is inevitable. The 25th dynasty of Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt with unprecedented authority, wealth, and culture, but power always invites rivals. Across the deserts and mountains to the northeast, one empire was growing, brutal and unstoppable: Assyria. Assyria was unlike any challenge Egypt had ever faced. Its armies were disciplined, ruthless, and fueled by conquest. Their weapons were advanced, their strategies cunning. They marched with efficiency that terrified all who opposed them, and when they set their sights on Kushite Egypt, they saw not a weak neighbor, but a kingdom that had unified the Nile Valley, a jewel of wealth and influence stretching across Africa and the Near East. The Kushites knew the threat. Taharqa, Piye's successor and one of the most remarkable rulers of the 25th dynasty, understood that diplomacy alone could not preserve his empire. Egypt's pharaohs had long relied on faith, ritual, and military prestige, but Assyria required something else: relentless defense, clever tactics, and psychological warfare. Taharqa combined these elements with the Nubian principles of adaptability and resilience. The first clashes were devastating. Assyrian armies pushed south, attempting to subdue Thebes, Memphis, and key Egyptian fortresses. Kushite archers met them on the battlefield, firing volleys with deadly precision. Chariots moved with unmatched coordination. Cities were defended not just by walls, but by the strategy and courage of their defenders. Yet, the Assyrians were relentless, laying siege to key cities and forcing Taharqa to make critical decisions. What's remarkable is how Taharqa managed these threats. He did not fight blindly. He moved strategically, sometimes withdrawing to preserve his forces, sometimes striking unexpectedly to demoralize the enemy. His campaigns were not just military, they were psychological. Each battle, each siege, each negotiation sent a clear message. The Black Pharaohs would not yield, not without a fight, not without proving their legitimacy. Yet Assyria's power was immense. They eventually captured key northern Egyptian cities. Temples were looted, statues shattered. The Nile itself seemed to mourn as foreign banners flew where Kushite authority once reigned unchallenged. But Taharqa refused to surrender. He retreated strategically to southern Egypt and Nubia, regrouping his forces. This retreat was not defeat, it was survival. A calculated move to preserve the dynasty and protect the cultural heart of Kushite Egypt. The Kushite kings used their knowledge of the Nile to their advantage. Unlike the Assyrians, they understood the river, the deserts, and the shifting seasons. They fortified southern cities, controlled trade routes, and leveraged local loyalty. Every palace, temple, and army barracks became a center of resistance. Every move was part of a larger strategy to endure, to outlast, and eventually to reclaim their legacy. This was more than a series of battles, it was a clash of civilizations. Assyria represented expansionist brutality, technological mastery, and relentless ambition. Kush represented adaptation, cultural legitimacy, and the resilience of African kingdoms. Their encounters were violent, yes, but they were also defining moments in world history. They showed that African rulers could not only govern a foreign empire, but resist the mightiest forces of the ancient world. During Taharqa's campaigns, Egypt itself became a chessboard. Northern cities were contested territories. Every decision mattered. Every general, soldier, and advisor played a critical role. Taharqa demonstrated not just courage, but tactical genius. He understood that his strength lay not only in his army, but in the legitimacy of his rule, the ability to unite disparate regions under one vision. Assyria's ultimate advantage was persistence. They returned again and again, using siege engines, iron weapons, and mercenary forces. Taharqa's forces held, retreated, and counterattacked, but the struggle was exhausting. Despite their extraordinary skills and the loyalty of their subjects, the Kushite rulers faced an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. The war tested everything the dynasty had built: alliances, faith, military discipline, and political authority. It revealed the limits of even the greatest empires and the vulnerability of power dependent on loyalty and geography. Yet, even under immense pressure, the Kushite pharaohs maintained their dignity, symbolism, and legitimacy. Temples continued to function, kings continued to be crowned, queens continued to wield authority. Civilization did not collapse, it adapted. This clash left an enduring mark on history. Assyria would eventually establish influence in northern Egypt, but it could not erase the legacy of the Kushite rulers. Taharqa's campaigns, leadership, and resilience ensured that the 25th dynasty would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary periods in African and Egyptian history. The Black Pharaohs had faced the might of Assyria and preserved their cultural identity, leaving a blueprint for leadership and survival in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of this confrontation teaches a powerful lesson. True power is not measured solely by conquest. It is measured by endurance, vision, and the ability to protect what you value most. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty exemplified this. They held Egypt not through fear alone, but through legitimacy, faith, and skill. They showed the world that African kingdoms were not passive bystanders in history. They were decisive actors, shaping the fate of nations. By the time the Assyrians receded, Taharqa and his successors had demonstrated something critical. Even when pushed to the brink, Kushite leadership could adapt, survive, and leave a legacy that would outlast even the fiercest armies. Their resilience, military prowess, and cultural integration solidified the dynasty's place in history as one of the most remarkable examples of African power in the ancient world. The clash of empires between Assyria and the Kushite pharaohs is not just a tale of war. It is a story of strategy, courage, cultural pride, and leadership. It reminds us that the Black Pharaohs were not only conquerors, they were guardians, unifiers, and visionaries who faced one of history's greatest military powers and ensured that Kushite identity, influence, and power endured. Taharqa. Even saying his name carries weight. He was no ordinary king, no simple successor. He was a storm wrapped in royal robes, a strategist, a warrior, a visionary. Taharqa was the embodiment of Kushite ambition, raised on the legacies of Pa and his predecessors, determined to cement the dynasty's place in history. Imagine Egypt at the time, the land of pyramids, temples, and gods. Its people proud but fractured, chaos lingering in the north, Assyrian armies threatening the borders. For most rulers, this would be overwhelming. For Taharqa, it was opportunity. He saw what others didn't. Egypt was fractured, but it could be united. Assyria was advancing, but it underestimated the ingenuity of Nubian kings. Taharqa had the vision and the courage to change the course of history. Taharqa's rise was marked by audacity. He didn't wait for Egypt to submit to his authority. He marched into Thebes, asserting both political and spiritual legitimacy. Temples were restored under his name. Priests pledged loyalty. Citizens obeyed not because of fear alone, but because he presented himself as the rightful embodiment of Matat, the divine order that governed the Nile and its people. Taharqa understood that power without legitimacy collapses. He fused authority with faith, winning hearts as well as territories. But Taharqa's genius was not limited to politics. He was a military mastermind. His armies, composed of Kushite archers, chariots, and disciplined infantry, moved with precision that rivaled any in the ancient world. When Assyria invaded, Taharqa didn't panic. He adapted. He used guerrilla tactics, controlling the Nile's geography, striking where Assyrians were vulnerable, retreating when necessary. Every battle, every maneuver, every campaign reflected his understanding of both strategy and psychology. Taharqa's greatest achievements, however, were not only on the battlefield. Under his reign, Kushite influence reached its zenith. Monuments and temples rose across Egypt, blending Nubian artistry with Egyptian tradition. Obelisks bearing his name and likeness were erected in Thebes. Statues depicted a king with African features, standing alongside gods. Taharqa's Egypt was a renaissance, a fusion of cultures that defied expectations and rewrote the narrative of African power. Economically, Taharqa strengthened the kingdom through trade. Gold from Nubia fueled Egyptian prosperity. Ivory, incense, and exotic goods flowed along the Nile. Cities flourished. Farmers thrived under improved irrigation techniques. Trade networks expanded south, east, and even toward the Mediterranean. This was a period of wealth and stability, showing that Taharqa's rule was not only military or spiritual, it was pragmatic and effective. But Taharqa was also tested like no other. Assyria's military campaigns intensified. Cities were besieged. Memphis fell temporarily to Assyrian forces. Taharqa had to retreat strategically, preserving his core strength in the south while continuing to challenge foreign dominance. He faced a choice every great ruler faces: surrender or adapt. Taharqa chose adaptation. His retreat was not defeat. It was survival and preparation for the next strike. Even in adversity, Taharqa demonstrated the resilience that defined the Kushite dynasty. He rebuilt fortresses, reorganized armies, maintained alliances. He communicated with his people through symbols of continuity, religious ceremonies, restored temples, and the visual power of the Kushite pharaoh ruling from the heart of Egypt. Every action reinforced his authority, reminding allies and enemies alike that Kushite power was enduring. Taharqa's influence extended beyond Egypt. In Nubia, he strengthened the heartland of Kushite power. Queens and nobles were given authority, ensuring internal stability while the king faced challenges abroad. His governance was a delicate balance of military might, political diplomacy, and cultural integration, a lesson in leadership that few rulers of the ancient world matched. The legacy of Taharqa is visible even today. Archaeological evidence, temples, pyramids, statues, inscriptions bears testimony to his reign. His monuments in Thebes and Cairo showcase a king who commanded both loyalty and awe. They show African kings ruling one of the world's most famous civilizations with authority, intelligence, and style. Taharqa was more than a king. He was a symbol of African excellence, resilience, and vision. But Taharqa's story also carries tragedy. Despite his brilliance, Assyria eventually regained control in northern Egypt. Taharqa retreated, preserving his dynasty's core in the south. The Kushite pharaohs would continue to rule, but the northern territories were lost. Even the greatest rulers face limits. Yet Taharqa's achievements cannot be measured solely by territory. His victories were cultural, spiritual, and historical. He proved that African kings could rule Egypt legitimately, integrate two cultures, defend against the mightiest armies, and leave a legacy that would echo through millennia. Taharqa challenges everything we think we know about ancient history. He was a black pharaoh who commanded the world's most iconic civilization. He fought empires, defended culture, and fused two great civilizations into one. And while history often minimizes his achievements, the stones of Thebes, the pyramids of Nubia, and the records of priests and scribes remind us Taharqa was extraordinary. This is not just history, it is a story of courage, vision, and leadership. Taharqa exemplifies what it means to rise above expectation, to defy invaders, and to rule with wisdom and power. His reign was the apex of the Kushite dynasty's influence in Egypt. It was a period when Africa's forgotten pharaohs reshaped the narrative of power and left a legacy that cannot be erased. Taharqa's life and reign prove one truth: greatness is not limited by geography, race, or expectation. It is defined by vision, action, and resilience. He challenged the ancient world and left it transformed forever. When you think of pyramids, your mind immediately jumps to Egypt. The massive structures at Giza, the Sphinx looming in the desert, the golden tombs of pharaohs, but the Nile's story doesn't end there. Far to the south, in the heart of Nubia, The kingdom of Kush built its own pyramids, smaller, sharper, steeper, yet no less impressive. These were not mere imitations, they were declarations of power, identity, and divine kingship. The pyramids of Kush were tombs of kings, queens, and nobility. They rose from the sands around Napata and later Meroe, forming necropolises that stretched across the desert horizon. Unlike the sprawling Giza plateau, these pyramids were compact yet daring. Some reached heights of over 100 feet, their angles sharper, their structures elegant and precise. Each pyramid was a statement. Kushite rulers belonged in the divine order, equal to or surpassing their Egyptian predecessors. Inside these pyramids lay treasures and symbolism. Artifacts, jewelry, ceremonial weapons, and personal items were buried with the deceased to accompany them into the afterlife. Gold, silver, and precious stones sparkled in the tombs, reflecting the wealth of a kingdom that controlled trade routes, gold mines, and vital resources for centuries. Nubian pyramids also contained intricately decorated chapels where priests performed rituals for the deceased king's journey to eternity. The Kushite approach to death and burial reflected a unique worldview. Unlike Egypt, where tombs often emphasized monumental scale and external visibility, Kushites focused on precision and spiritual significance. The pyramids were both gateways and symbols. They represented the pharaoh's passage into the divine, the connection between heaven and earth, and the continuity of the kingdom's power beyond death. Each burial was a reaffirmation of legitimacy, reminding the living that the king's authority persisted even in the afterlife. Meroe, the later capital of Kush, became the center for pyramid building. Over 200 pyramids stand in its necropolis today, clustered tightly in rows across the desert landscape. The sheer number and density reflect the dynasty's continuity and the cultural importance of these monuments. Every pyramid tells a story, not just of a ruler, but of an entire civilization that thrived, fought, and endured over centuries. The architecture of these pyramids reveals remarkable innovation. Constructed with sandstone blocks, the Kushites perfected steep angles and compact designs, differentiating themselves from Egyptian styles. Inscriptions on the walls depict royal achievements, military victories, religious devotion, and genealogies. They serve as both historical records and symbolic affirmations of power. Through these pyramids, the Kushites literally etched their identity into the desert. Beyond architecture, the pyramids reveal a kingdom deeply connected to spirituality and ritual. Priests played a critical role in the construction, design, and ceremonial functions of these tombs. Sacred rituals ensured that kings passed safely into the afterlife, reinforcing the kingdom's connection to divine authority. This spiritual dimension reinforced political legitimacy, an idea central to Kushite rulership. A king was not only a ruler, he was a mediator between gods and people, living and dead. The pyramids also hold lessons about resilience and adaptation. While smaller than Egypt's Great Pyramids, they survived centuries of weathering, conquest, and neglect. Looters attempted to strip them of wealth, yet their stones endure, standing as silent witnesses to a civilization that history almost forgot. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, which were occasionally assimilated into later constructions, Kushite pyramids retained their distinct identity, signaling an independent cultural and political legacy. Archaeology has revealed that these tombs were not isolated. Surrounding each pyramid were temples, chapels, and smaller burials for attendants and soldiers. This layout demonstrates the complexity of Kushite society. Rulers were central, yet the kingdom functioned as an organized hierarchy with priests, nobles, and military officials integrated into the social and religious fabric. The pyramids are therefore both tombs and microcosms of Kushite civilization itself. What makes these structures extraordinary is the symbolism of identity. For centuries, history has framed ancient Egypt as the sole source of African civilization, sidelining Kush. But these pyramids tell a different story. They shout across millennia. Kush was powerful. Kush was wealthy. Kush was sophisticated. And Kushite kings were no less divine, no less legitimate than their northern counterparts. Even today, the pyramids of Kush challenge perceptions. They are sharp, daring, and elegant. They are monuments to ambition, resilience, and African ingenuity. They are evidence of a civilization that thrived despite challenges, conquered empires, and left a lasting legacy visible long after political power faded. Visiting Meroe or Napata, you cannot help but feel the presence of the past. The desert wind whispers across the stones, carrying stories of kings who commanded armies, queens who wielded authority, and priests who guided souls into eternity. Every pyramid stands as a testament to African leadership, artistry, and spiritual depth. The pyramids of Kush are more than tombs. They are proof that African civilizations ruled with vision, innovation, and strength. They remind the world that the Black Pharaohs left a legacy of power and culture as enduring as the Nile itself. The story of these pyramids is a story of survival, identity, and remembrance. They are the voices of a people who refuse to be erased, carving their existence into stone for eternity. Beyond the deserts and the Nile's bend lies Meroe, the beating heart of Kush after Napata. This city wasn't just a capital, it was a powerhouse, an industrial hub, a center of trade, innovation, and strategy that rivaled any metropolis of the ancient world. When historians speak of Meroe, they are speaking of Africa's own Iron Age marvel, an empire that produced wealth, weapons, and ideas that shaped a continent. Meroe rose as Napata declined. Its location was strategic, situated near rich iron ore deposits and trade routes, linking Africa to Egypt, the Red Sea, and beyond. The city was perfectly positioned to exploit natural resources while maintaining independence from northern powers. Kushite kings recognized the potential. Under their vision, Meroe transformed into an industrial, cultural, and political powerhouse. The iron industry was the lifeblood of Meroe. Archaeologists have uncovered massive furnaces, slag heaps, and workshops. Blacksmiths produced iron tools, weapons, and agricultural implements that fueled both domestic life and military campaigns. Kushite iron was renowned for its quality, and it was traded across Africa and into the Middle East. Meroe didn't just survive, it thrived because it controlled one of the most valuable resources of the ancient world. Trade wasn't limited to iron. Meroe was a bustling marketplace where gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic goods moved along the Nile. Merchants traveled hundreds of miles, bringing luxury items and cultural ideas. The city's wealth was visible in its architecture, temples, and royal palaces. Monumental structures reflected both Kushite tradition and Egyptian influence, showcasing a civilization that blended innovation with deep respect for heritage. Meroe was also a cultural capital. Its rulers commissioned temples to gods like Amun and Epidemic, integrating Egyptian and Nubian religious practices. Priests held significant authority, guiding not just spiritual life, but political decisions. Art flourished. Statues, reliefs, and inscriptions reveal a society that valued beauty, expression, and divine symbolism. This was not a peripheral outpost. It was a center of African civilization in every sense. The city's military prowess was equally formidable. Iron weapons gave Meroe a technological advantage over neighbors, Archers, infantry, and charioteers moved in disciplined formations, prepared to defend the city or project power across the region. The kingdom's ability to produce its own weapons ensured independence from foreign powers and sustained its influence for centuries. Queens and kings ruled with a balance of authority and strategy. The Kandakes, powerful queen mothers, wielded military and political power alongside the king. One of the most famous, Amanirinas, led armies against Roman incursions, proving that Meroe's power was not limited to the Nile but extended into global geopolitics. Leadership in Meroe was about vision, courage, and the ability to command loyalty and respect. Economically, Meroe was self-sustaining. Its agriculture thrived thanks to sophisticated irrigation and knowledge of the Nile's seasonal cycles. Crops supported urban populations, armies, and trade. The combination of natural resources, technological innovation, and strategic location created an empire capable of competing with the great civilizations of the Mediterranean world. Yet Meroe was more than industry and commerce. It was a symbol of resilience. After centuries of Egyptian influence, Kushite culture adapted, absorbed, and innovated. Meroe represents the apex of African ingenuity in governance, metallurgy, and urban planning. It demonstrates that African civilizations were not merely participants in global history, they were shapers of it. The pyramids near Meroe echo this power. Tombs of kings and queens rise sharply from the desert, marking both death and authority. Inscriptions tell stories of conquests, wealth, and divine favor. Temples and shrines scattered across the city reflect the spiritual and cultural depth of the kingdom. Every stone is a declaration. Kush was not forgotten. Kush mattered. Meroe also played a strategic role in diplomacy. The city maintained relationships with Egypt, Rome, and other African kingdoms. Treaties, marriages, and alliances allowed it to navigate complex political landscapes. The kingdom's leaders understood that survival and prosperity depended on intelligence as much as military might. The legacy of Meroe is profound. It lasted over 1,000 years, outlasting empires that sought to dominate it. Its pyramids, temples, ironworks, and artifacts remind the world that Africa had its own centers of power, creativity, and innovation long before European exploration. Meroe was not a footnote, it was a capital of civilization. Visiting the ruins today, you can feel the pulse of the city. The wind carries echoes of blacksmiths hammering iron, traders calling out across markets, priests chanting in temples. The stones whisper stories of kings and queens who ruled with vision, skill, and courage. Every corner of Meroe speaks of resilience, ingenuity, and African greatness. The story of Meroe proves that the kingdom of Kush was not only capable of surviving Egypt's dominance, it thrived, innovated, and shaped history on its own terms. It was a city of industry, culture, spirituality, and strategy. Its influence stretched far beyond its borders, challenging the notion that Africa was peripheral to ancient civilization. Meroe remains one of the most extraordinary cities in human history. Its iron, wealth, and culture tell a story of a kingdom that commanded its destiny, resisted foreign domination, and left a legacy that still resonates today. It is the heart of Kush, the pulse of African power, and a reminder that greatness is often found where history has almost forgotten. When we talk about rulers, we often think of kings, the pharaohs, the generals, the men who commanded armies and built monuments. But in Kush, power wore many faces. Some of the most formidable leaders were women, queens who ruled not from behind the scenes, but from the very center of authority. These were the Kandakes, the queen mothers, warriors and strategists who shaped the destiny of the kingdom. The term Kandake, often translated as Queen Mother, does not capture their full influence. These women were sovereign rulers, military leaders, and political masterminds. Their authority was not symbolic. They wielded power directly, made critical decisions, commanded armies, and sometimes even ruled independently of male kings. One of the most legendary among them was Amenarenas, whose name still resonates with awe and respect. Amenarenas ruled during one of the most challenging periods in Kushite history. The Roman Empire, a colossal power stretching across the Mediterranean, had extended its reach into Egypt. To most kingdoms, Rome represented an unstoppable force. But Amenarenas did not cower. She gathered her army, prepared her warriors, and led them into battle against the Romans. The kingdom of Kush had a queen at its helm, standing as both protector and symbol of independence. The battle against Rome was fierce. Amenarenas commanded troops with strategy and courage. Kushite archers, skilled in desert warfare and river campaigns, moved in coordinated attacks. Despite facing an empire that seemed invincible, the Kushites scored victories, defending their lands and forcing the Romans into negotiations. The queen's leadership was decisive. She was not just a figurehead, she was the embodiment of Kushite resilience and ingenuity. Queens of Kush also influenced culture and religion. They participated in temple rituals, commissioned monuments, and reinforced the divine legitimacy of the dynasty. Inscriptions and statues depict them wearing regalia as elaborate as any king, often with symbols of divine authority. Their presence in religious life was not ceremonial, it was central. They ensured that Kushite society remained united, spiritually grounded, and culturally vibrant. These women were architects of diplomacy as well. They forged alliances, managed trade relations, and maintained stability during times of war. Kushite queens understood the delicate balance between power and diplomacy. They could negotiate with foreign empires while inspiring loyalty among their own people. Their decisions often determined whether the kingdom survived or fell. The influence of Kandakes extended to succession and governance. They ensured that royal bloodlines remained strong, educated heirs, and occasionally assumed direct control when kings were too young or absent. In a male-dominated ancient world, these women not only survived, they thrived, commanding respect from allies and fear from enemies. Their leadership challenges modern assumptions about gender and authority in ancient civilizations. Archaeological evidence supports their power. Pyramids and tombs dedicated to queens in Meroe and Napata rival those of kings in size, complexity, and decoration. Inscriptions boast of military campaigns led by queens, trade agreements they oversaw, and their divine favor. These structures are enduring reminders that Kushite women were not secondary players, they were central to the kingdom's identity and survival. The story of Kushite queens also reshapes the narrative of African history. While history often minimizes female leadership, the Kandakas prove that African civilizations embraced complex social structures where women could wield immense authority. Their legacy challenges stereotypes and reminds the world that power was not confined to men, even in ancient times. Amenarenas's confrontation with Rome remains legendary. After defeating a Roman army, she negotiated favorable terms, maintaining Kushite sovereignty and demonstrating political acumen equal to any emperor. This event is a testament not only to her military skill but also to the strategic genius of Kushite leadership. She proved that strength was measured not just in armies, but in vision, courage, and negotiation. Queens like Amenarenas ensured that the kingdom of Kush endured beyond the 25th dynasty. Even as external threats rose and dynastic power shifted, The influence of these women persisted. They preserved culture, protected borders, and inspired generations. Their presence reminds us that leadership is not defined by gender, but by wisdom, courage, and the ability to shape history. The Kandakes were more than rulers. They were symbols of resistance, strategy, and resilience. They embodied the heart of Kushite civilization, balancing military might, spiritual authority, and political governance. Their stories prove that the history of Kush is not just the story of kings, pyramids, or battles. It is the story of extraordinary women who defied expectations and secured the legacy of an African empire. In every sculpture, every inscription, and every pyramid, the power of these queens is visible. They remind us that the kingdom of Kush was a civilization where women could rise to the highest positions, challenge the mightiest empires, and leave a mark that echoes across millennia. The kingdom of Kush was not only a political and military power, it was a cultural powerhouse. Its art, architecture, and traditions tell a story of a civilization that thrived at the intersection of African identity and Egyptian influence. Kushite art is bold, distinctive, and unapologetically African, yet it reflects the sophisticated aesthetics of the Nile Valley. Every sculpture, every relief, every object carries a message of power, faith, and identity. Kushite artists mastered stone, wood, and metal. Their sculptures often depicted kings, queens, and deities with African features, full lips, broad noses, and curly hair, asserting the Nubian identity at the heart of their rule. This was a deliberate statement. By crafting their rulers with authentic features, Kushites rejected the erasure of African influence in Egypt and ensured their legacy was visually undeniable. These images were not mere decoration. They were propaganda, spiritual expression, and cultural affirmation all at once. Religious art was central to Kushite culture. Temples dedicated to Amun, Apedemek, and other deities were adorned with reliefs showing kings and queens performing rituals, leading armies, or offering tribute to the gods. The intertwining of political and spiritual imagery reinforced the legitimacy of Kushite rulers. Art became a tool for communicating power, divine favor, and continuity of authority. The temples themselves were architectural marvels, blending Egyptian styles with local innovation, including unique column designs and decorative motifs that reflected Nubian aesthetics. Metalwork was another hallmark of Kushite culture. Iron and bronze were crafted into weapons, jewelry, ceremonial items, and statues. Blacksmiths in Meroe and Napata honed their craft to perfection, producing tools that were both functional and artistic. The iron industry not only fueled the economy, but also became a medium for artistic expression, demonstrating the kingdom's technological sophistication alongside its aesthetic achievements. Pottery and everyday objects were also beautifully crafted. Unlike many civilizations where utilitarian items were plain, Kushite pottery often carried elaborate patterns and symbolic motifs. These designs tell stories of the people's beliefs, social hierarchy, and connection to the Nile. They were practical, but they also carried cultural significance, showing that art was integrated into daily life, not confined to temples or tombs. One of the most fascinating aspects of Kushite art is the portrayal of women. Kandakes, queens, and priestesses appear frequently in sculptures and reliefs, often depicted with authority equal to kings. This visual emphasis reinforces the political power of women in Kushite society. It also communicates to future generations that leadership, courage, and divine connection were not limited by gender. Art was, in this way, both documentation and inspiration. Architecture reflected both grandeur and innovation. Temples, palaces and pyramids were constructed with attention to proportion, symbolism, and durability. Kushite architects adapted Egyptian techniques, creating structures that were functional, imposing, and aesthetically striking. The necropolises of Napata and Meroe, with their compact pyramids and ceremonial chapels, are examples of design that combine spiritual significance with practical ingenuity. Every building was a statement of power, culture, and permanence. Music and dance also played critical roles. While physical evidence is scarce, depictions on temple walls and artifacts indicate a vibrant cultural life. Ritual dances, accompanied by drums, flutes, and other instruments, were part of ceremonies honoring gods and kings. These performances were not entertainment alone. They reinforced social cohesion, communicated spiritual narratives, and celebrated the kingdom's identity. The Kushites were also skilled scribes and record keepers. Inscriptions on temples, monuments, and tombs documented historical events, royal lineage, military victories, and religious practices. These texts were both records and propaganda, ensuring that the achievements of the kingdom were preserved for posterity. By writing history in stone, the Kushites claimed their place in the narrative of African civilization. Trade enriched cultural exchange. Nubia was a crossroads connecting sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Through trade, Kush absorbed new ideas, motifs, and materials which influenced art, fashion, and religious practices. Yet, rather than simply imitating foreign influences, Kushite culture integrated them, creating something uniquely African and distinctly Kushite. This fusion became a hallmark of the kingdom's identity. Perhaps most importantly, Kushite culture emphasized resilience and identity. Every work of art, every monument, every ritual expressed a civilization confident in its power and proud of its heritage. Even as Egypt and other empires dominated narratives of history, Kushites preserved their identity through artistic expression, ensuring that future generations would recognize their achievements. The legacy of Kushite art and culture is enduring. Archaeologists continue to uncover treasures that challenge misconceptions about African civilizations. The pyramids, temples, sculptures, and artifacts of Kush demonstrate a society that was complex, creative, and sophisticated, far from peripheral but central to the story of human civilization. The art of Kush was more than decoration. It was communication, identity, and defiance. It told the world, we are powerful, we are African, we are eternal. And though centuries tried to bury these stories, the legacy of the Kushites speaks louder than ever, reminding the world of Africa's forgotten pharaohs. No empire lasts forever. The kingdom of Kush, which had risen with such brilliance, eventually faced the inexorable forces of change. The fall of Kush was not sudden. It was gradual, a combination of internal pressures, external threats, and the shifting sands of politics and economy. Yet, in its decline, the kingdom still left a mark on history, proving that even forgotten civilizations can shape the world. By the 4th century CE, Meroe, the heart of Kushite power, began to show signs of vulnerability. Political instability grew within the royal court. Succession disputes weakened the central authority, creating factions that competed for power. Unlike the days of Pa and Taharqa, when leadership was decisive and unified, the later kings and queens struggled to maintain cohesion. Without strong visionary rulers, the kingdom's strength slowly eroded. Economic challenges compounded political instability. Trade routes that had once enriched Kush were increasingly threatened by shifting regional powers. Egypt and the Mediterranean world no longer depended solely on Nubian goods. Iron, once the cornerstone of the kingdom's economy, faced competition. Natural resources were still abundant, but the kingdom's ability to control them and maintain wealth was weakening. Without economic stability, even the most powerful empires falter. External threats accelerated Kush's decline. Nomadic groups from the desert, once minor irritations, began to press on the borders. The rise of neighboring African kingdoms introduced new rivals for control of trade and territory. And though Kush had previously resisted the Romans and Assyrians, the balance of power had shifted. The empire that had once commanded respect and fear now faced enemies capable of challenging its authority at multiple fronts. Religion and culture, which had once unified the kingdom, also faced transformation. Temples fell into disrepair, rituals were abandoned, and the authority of priests waned. While the artistic and architectural achievements endured, the spiritual cohesion that had supported kingship weakened. The symbolic power of the pharaohs and queens was less effective in maintaining control over a changing population. Despite these challenges, Kush continued to resist complete collapse for centuries. Its armies defended the core territories along the Nile. Leaders attempted reforms, and queens like Amanishakheto oversaw the construction of pyramids and temples, even in these turbulent times. But the glory days of empire, conquest, wealth, and dominance over Egypt were gone. Kush had become a shadow of its former self, struggling to preserve identity and sovereignty. The final blow came from the rise of the kingdom of Aksum. To the southeast, Aksumite forces attacked Meroe around the 4th or 5th century CE, marking the end of the city as a political and economic powerhouse. The pyramids and temples were abandoned. Kings and queens vanished from the political stage. Yet even in defeat, the cultural and architectural legacy of Kush endured. The ruins of Meroe, Napata, and the pyramids stand as testaments to a civilization that refused to be erased entirely. The decline of Kush also illustrates the fragility of empires dependent on trade, natural resources, and strategic geography. When these pillars weaken through competition, environmental changes, or political instability, even the most resilient civilizations struggle to survive. Yet, Kush's story is also one of resilience. Its cultural, religious, and artistic achievements outlived political collapse, influencing future generations and neighboring societies. Interestingly, Kush's fall did not mean its disappearance from memory entirely. Nubian culture persisted in the region, influencing local kingdoms and communities for centuries. The spiritual, artistic, and architectural traditions of the Kushites survived, embedded in the identity of the Nile Valley and beyond. Their legacy became invisible only to the casual historian, but it remained deeply present for those who understood the region's history. The story of Kush's decline is not just about loss, it is about endurance, adaptation, and the lasting imprint of civilization. Even after political collapse, the kingdom's pyramids, iron industry, temples, and cultural identity spoke of a society that had shaped Africa and the world. History may have tried to forget Kush, but the stones, artifacts, and ruins tell a different story, a story of greatness that could not be entirely erased. Kush's fall reminds us that power is transient, but influence is eternal. Empires rise and fall, but culture, innovation, and identity survive. The Kushite kings and queens may no longer rule. Their armies may have disbanded, but the lessons of resilience, strategy, and cultural pride endure. They show that even forgotten civilizations can shape the narrative of human history in ways that resonate across millennia. In the end, the decline of Kush is a chapter of reflection. It demonstrates that even the mightiest civilizations are subject to time, change, and external pressures. but it also proves that a kingdom's legacy is not measured solely by its longevity. It is measured by the mark it leaves on art, culture, architecture, and human imagination. The kingdom of Kush may have fallen, but it never truly disappeared from the story of Africa or the world. Religion in Kush was the heartbeat of the kingdom. It shaped politics, guided kings, inspired art, and defined the daily lives of its people. The Kushites believed that power flowed not just from armies or trade, but from the gods themselves. Their spiritual worldview was deeply intertwined with their identity as African rulers, as custodians of the Nile, and as heirs to traditions older than the pyramids themselves. Central to Kushite belief was the god Amun, whose worship had been imported from Egypt but transformed in Nubia. At Jebel Barkal, a massive sandstone cliff near Napata, the Kushites identified a sacred connection between heaven and earth. Here Amun was more than a deity, he was the divine authority that legitimized kingship. Pharaohs of Kush, like Pie and Tahaka, were seen as chosen by Amun, their rule sanctioned by the gods themselves. Religious ceremonies at this site reinforced the unity of the kingdom and the divine mandate of the rulers. Epidemic, the lion-headed warrior god, was uniquely Kushite. Unlike Egyptian deities, Epidemic symbolized strength, courage, and protection, reflecting the martial and resilient spirit of the kingdom. Temples dedicated to him showcased powerful imagery, kings and queens depicted in battle, lions roaring in reliefs, and ceremonial rituals emphasizing the connection between the divine and earthly authority. Epidemic was not just a god to worship, he was a model for leadership. Kings drew inspiration from his ferocity, courage, and guardianship. Religion extended beyond kings and gods. Priests played a central role in maintaining both spiritual and political order. They conducted rituals, advised rulers, and oversaw temple administration. In Kush, the priesthood wielded immense influence. They interpreted omens, mediated disputes, and guided the kingdom's moral compass. Their authority ensured that even in times of war or political uncertainty, the kingdom remained spiritually anchored. Daily life in Kush was also shaped by religious belief. Ordinary people participated in rituals, festivals, and offerings. Homes contained small altars or symbols of gods, and children were educated in the stories of divine heroes and ancestors. Religious festivals were not merely ceremonial, they reinforced social cohesion, reminding citizens of the values of courage, loyalty, and respect for tradition. Spiritual life was a living, breathing aspect of culture, inseparable from governance, art, and identity. Ancestor worship played a critical role in Kushite spirituality. Kings, queens, and nobles were revered even after death, and their tombs became sites of ongoing ritual. The pyramids and temples of Napata and Meroe were designed not only to honor the dead, but to connect the living with the ancestors. This belief reinforced continuity, legitimacy, and a sense of enduring identity. Each pyramid was both a resting place and a spiritual beacon, linking past, present, and future. Kushite religious art was vivid and symbolic. Statues, reliefs, and inscriptions depicted gods, rulers, and rituals with remarkable precision. The use of color, geometry, and iconography conveyed complex ideas about divinity, kingship, and morality. Through art, religion communicated lessons, courage, piety, loyalty, and justice. Every temple wall told a story, every carving reinforced a message, and every symbol reminded the kingdom that the gods watched, guided, and protected. The Kushites also integrated practical spirituality into governance. Kings consulted oracles before campaigns, priests blessed armies, and rituals ensured prosperity during trade expeditions. Religion was inseparable from survival. The Nile's floods, crucial for agriculture, were interpreted as divine signs. Political decisions, military strategies, and social policies were all informed by spiritual guidance. Faith was not passive, it was actionable, and it reinforced the strength of the kingdom. Women played a central role in religious life as well. Queens and priestesses performed rituals alongside kings, conducted ceremonies and maintained temples. Their authority was not symbolic, it was real, influencing governance, diplomacy, and military decisions. The intertwining of female power with spiritual authority reinforced the idea that leadership in Kush was multidimensional, balanced between gender, religion, and politics. Religion in Kush also emphasized the afterlife. Burial practices, pyramid designs, and temple rituals reflected a belief in life beyond death. Funerary items, jewelry, and inscriptions ensured that rulers would continue to influence the living world from the afterlife. This worldview reinforced social hierarchy and political stability. The divine right of kings extended beyond mortality, anchoring authority in eternal order. The spiritual life of Kush was dynamic and adaptive. While borrowing elements from Egyptian religion, the Kushites infused them with local symbolism, African deities, and cultural priorities. This synthesis created a religion that was uniquely Kushite, both familiar and innovative, grounded in tradition yet reflective of a distinct African identity. Ultimately, the religion and spirituality of Kush were not peripheral. They were central to governance, identity, and resilience. They legitimized rulers, guided armies, reinforced culture, and inspired art. The Black Pharaohs of Kush ruled with divine sanction, and the people's faith strengthened the kingdom's endurance. Even as political power waned, these spiritual traditions persisted, leaving an indelible mark on African civilization and human history. The kingdom of Kush was not isolated. Far from being a distant, forgotten African state, Kush was a vital player in the geopolitics of the ancient world. Its location along the Nile made it a crossroads of commerce, culture, and conflict. The kingdom engaged with Egypt, Rome, and even sub-Saharan and Red Sea civilizations, influencing and being influenced by the broader currents of global history. Kush's relationship with Egypt was foundational. The Nile linked the two regions, but it was more than geography that bound them. Egypt saw Kush as both a rival and a source of trade and labor. During the 25th dynasty, Kushite kings became pharaohs of Egypt itself, ruling the entire Nile Valley. This was not symbolic, it was real political power, a moment when African rulers governed one of the most iconic civilizations in history. Taharqa, Pir, and their successors held the pharaonic titles, administered the temples, and commanded the armies of Egypt. This period represents the height of Kushite influence, where African leadership was not peripheral but central to global history. The Kushites were astute diplomats. They negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and established alliances with neighboring powers. These relationships were strategic. Kush relied on diplomacy as much as military might to maintain its sovereignty. For example, interactions with Egypt were marked by cycles of conflict and cooperation. Kushite rulers knew when to fight and when to negotiate, balancing aggression with pragmatism. The Romans recognized Kush as a power to be respected. During Amenerid's reign, Kushite forces confronted Roman Egypt. The conflict was significant. Kushitites invaded southern Egypt, capturing territories and then negotiating favorable terms after confronting the Roman legions. This episode demonstrates that Kush was not a minor state. It could challenge one of history's most formidable empires and secure its interests. Kushite diplomacy and military strength earned the respect of even the Mediterranean world. Trade connected Kush to regions far beyond the Nile. Gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic goods moved through the kingdom, reaching the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. Meroe became a hub of commerce, linking Africa to global markets. Kushite iron was particularly valuable, fueling both domestic industries and foreign economies. Through trade, Kush influenced technological, cultural, and economic developments far beyond its borders. Religion and culture also served as points of connection. Egyptian gods were worshipped in Kush, but local deities like Epidamak had influence beyond the kingdom. Temples, monuments, and inscriptions conveyed cultural messages to neighboring regions, showing that Kushite identity could integrate with global traditions while maintaining its uniqueness. Artifacts from Kush have been found in regions far from the Nile, illustrating cultural exchange and influence. Kush's interactions with sub-Saharan Africa were equally significant. Trade routes extended southward, bringing goods, ideas, and cultural practices from the interior of the continent. Kush acted as a bridge, connecting North Africa and the Mediterranean with the heart of the African continent. This role as a conduit for trade and culture ensured that the kingdom was not only powerful but strategically essential in the global network of the ancient world. The kingdom's military campaigns also placed it on the global stage. Kushite armies moved strategically, defending borders and projecting power into Egypt and beyond. Their confrontations with Assyria, Egypt, and Rome were not isolated skirmishes. They were part of a broader narrative of power, diplomacy, and empire in the ancient world. Kush's ability to endure and negotiate with these great powers reflects its strategic intelligence and resilience. Kush's legacy in global history is profound, yet often overlooked. While empires like Rome and Egypt dominate textbooks, Kush demonstrates that African civilizations were central participants in global political, economic, and cultural networks. Its kings ruled powerful territories, its queens negotiated with empires, and its people contributed to technological, religious, and artistic achievements recognized across continents. Even after the decline of Meroe, Kushite culture continued to influence neighboring regions. Architectural styles, religious practices, and artistic motifs were absorbed and adapted by subsequent African kingdoms. The legacy of Kush persisted, shaping the cultural and political landscape of northeastern Africa long after the kingdom itself had faded. Kush's story challenges the conventional narrative of ancient history. It forces us to reconsider the global impact of African civilizations and recognize their role as central actors, not mere spectators. The Kingdom of Kush was a civilization that connected continents, influenced empires, and asserted African power on a world stage. In the end, Kush's connections with Egypt, Rome, and other regions reveal a civilization that was dynamic, strategic, and indispensable to ancient geopolitics. It was a kingdom that negotiated, fought, traded, and thrived, leaving an enduring legacy that reshaped the understanding of Africa's place in global history. The Kingdom of Kush may have faded from political power centuries ago, but its legacy is impossible to erase. Its pyramids still pierce the desert sky, its temples whisper stories of gods and kings, and its art continues to reveal the sophistication and identity of an African civilization that defied the odds. Kush's story is a testament to resilience, creativity, and leadership, and it reminds the world that Africa's history is far richer and more complex than often acknowledged. Kushite kings and queens reshaped the narrative of African power. They ruled Egypt, defended their lands against empires like Assyria and Rome, and ensured that Nubian culture endured. Figures like Taharqa and Amenirinis challenge modern assumptions about ancient Africa. They were not passive, peripheral or subservient. They were visionaries, warriors and rulers, whose authority and influence rivaled any in the ancient world. Their achievements demand recognition, study and admiration. The pyramids of Napata and Meroe stand as eternal symbols of Kushite power and ingenuity. These monuments remind us that the African continent produced civilizations capable of monumental architecture, spiritual sophistication, and cultural continuity. While often overshadowed by the pyramids of Egypt, the Nubian pyramids reflect a unique identity, sharper, steeper, and undeniably African. They are a testament to ambition, innovation, and the ability to leave a lasting mark on the world. Art and culture remain among Kush's most enduring legacies. Sculptures, reliefs, jewelry, and temples reveal a society proud of its identity, confident in its rulers, and deeply spiritual. Kushite art communicates messages of power, gender equality, and divine authority, challenging centuries of historical erasure. Every artifact is a voice from the past, reminding us that Kushites were creators, not just inheritors, of civilization. Kushite religion also left a lasting imprint. The worship of Amun, Apidemak, and other deities, along with intricate rituals and priestly authority, shaped societal structures and governance. These spiritual practices reinforced unity, morality, and continuity, demonstrating the profound connection between religion and statecraft. Even after the political collapse, the spiritual traditions of Kush influenced neighboring regions and contributed to Africa's cultural mosaic. Trade and diplomacy show another dimension of Kush's enduring influence. By connecting sub-Saharan Africa to Egypt, the Media, and the Red Sea, Kushites shaped economic and cultural networks. Their iron, gold, and ivory were sought after far beyond the Nile, positioning the kingdom as a central player in the ancient global economy. Kush proved that African civilizations were not isolated. They were active, strategic participants in a wider world. The story of the Kandakes, the queens of Kush, further cements the kingdom's legacy. Their leadership, military prowess, and political influence challenge assumptions about gender in history. These women defended the kingdom, negotiated with empires, and ensured dynastic continuity. Their example resonates today as a reminder that leadership is not defined by gender, but by courage, wisdom, and vision. Despite centuries of neglect in mainstream history, Kush continues to inspire. Archaeologists and historians are uncovering its achievements, reclaiming the narrative, and showing that Africa's past is full of empires that rivaled Egypt, Rome, and Assyria in power, sophistication, and influence. The Kingdom of Kush is a beacon, proving that African civilizations were central to human history, not peripheral. Kush also teaches resilience. Its rise, flourishing, and eventual decline illustrate the cycles of history. Empires fall, but culture, identity, and influence endure. The stones of Meroe and Napata may be weathered, but they carry lessons of leadership, innovation, and vision. They remind future generations that greatness is not only measured by political dominance, but by the lasting imprint on culture, art, and collective memory. Today, scholars, students, and explorers are reclaiming Kush's story. Museums display artifacts, researchers study inscriptions, and documentaries bring the kingdom to life for global audiences. These efforts shine a light on Africa's forgotten pharaohs, challenging centuries of historical omission and inspiring pride in the continent's rich heritage. The Kingdom of Kush was more than a civilization. It was a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and power of African peoples. Its kings, queens, warriors, priests and artisans created a world that blended strength, spirituality and sophistication. From Taharka's campaigns to the Kandaka's courage, from the pyramids of Meroe to the ironworks that fueled its economy, Kush left a legacy that continues to resonate. To remember Kush is to remember that Africa was never passive in the story of human civilization. It was a land of visionaries, builders, rulers, and innovators. The forgotten pharaohs of Kush were extraordinary, and their legacy continues to challenge, inspire, and educate. They remind us that history is not complete without their voices, and the Nile still carries their story through the desert sands, eternal and unbroken. The kingdom of Kush is no longer forgotten. It lives in its pyramids, its art, its stories, and in every person who seeks to understand the true scope of human achievement. Remember the kings, remember the queens, remember the people of Kush. They were rulers, innovators, and visionaries. They were Africa's forgotten pharaohs, and their legacy is eternal. This concludes the full script. If the story of the kingdom of Kush has amazed you, inspired you, and opened your eyes to Africa's forgotten pharaohs, don't let this history fade again. Hit that subscribe button and join us on a journey through the hidden corners of our world's past. Share this video to spread the story of Kush and the incredible rulers who shaped an empire. Comment below with your thoughts. Let the legacy of these kings and queens spark curiosity, pride, and discovery. Dive deeper, learn more, and together, let's uncover the truths history tried to forget. Your adventure into the past starts now. Don't miss a single chapter.